So bring your physical body to equilibrium. Notice how it differs from last time you were meditating. If you feel fatigue, it's great to be able to check in with that. Notice how that arises to the mind based on certain physical sensations. Find the equilibrium of your breath, releasing all the way into the exhalation. Let your mind be calm, clear, bright. You can deliberately expand your awareness with your eyes open or closed to brighten your mind. Intensifying and expanding at the same time. And then release it into space, not holding on to anything. And then recall your teacher in your heart. And what it is you aspire to, whether in the short term or the long term or both. And then gently open your eyes. Continue. So I realized that one of my main purposes, you can tell I have a lot of main purposes, but one of my main purposes in this teaching is to offer us a way of thinking about an outer world that is genuinely shared, in a way that makes sense to us. I just want to say, like, that's livable, that doesn't feel like we're living in cognitive dissonance, trying to plant karmic seeds to create things in an outer world, but not really fathoming how our inner landscape could affect the concrete, physical stuff, much less what other people do to us. Like, that's one of the hardest parts about karma, right? We can see the karmic propensities in how I see my world, and I see it this way because I saw it that way 5 years ago, or because I planted those seeds in my mind. Or even a karmic propensity to see yellow and identify it as yellow because there was a seed in my mind from birth to be able to see certain colors as a human being. But when people do things to us, and if they have their own karma, how is my karma related to that? So I'm not saying when people do things to us, it's only because of their karma. I never said that. And so once I said, once we start experimenting with doing things deliberately to try to affect change in our world and dedicating our actions to specific benefit for ourselves and others, and we actually see it work. We actually see correlations start to arise. Then the philosophical question can almost become stronger. Why? What kind of world does this have to be for people to actually show up with no apparent reason from their own side, and yet somehow fulfilling the very specific karmic seeds that I know I planted? And yet not to fall in that other extreme of, I just created the karmic stream of this person who has no reality of their own. And I don't mean no inherent nature of their own, because none of us have that. I just mean no conventional reality from their perspective that could validly be labeling themselves in a certain way. That's what I would, so the wrong view part of that is what I would call solipsism, where we get so caught up in the I'm creating my world pole that we forget to say for me, and lose how it is that other people are creating their worlds. But as I say, the complex part is how can both be happening at the same time and somehow interaction happens, and we can have conversations and we can have relationships and we can affect each other. Because frankly, if we can't affect each other, what point is there in becoming a bodhisattva? Just to make our world look different to us? That's not the point. If love is real, if compassion is real, it's because we want other people's mind streams and their individual personal experience to be better. But if we're thinking about it carefully, we need some philosophical tools to be able to repeat that to ourselves and go deeper and deeper and deeper in how we think about it. So I've been leading to this for a while, and I'll never be satisfied with how it comes out. But maybe it'll almost be easier to understand an overview than if I went into all the fine points. There's a series of analogies that come up in the course of this particular section, which is quite long, of the elimination of the true thought, when Master Chandrakirti is debating the supposed mind-only school opponent. And in several of the cases, it's the mind-only school opponent who apparently, I mean, he's set up that way because the text is Chandrakirti's. He got to make up the dialogue. He got to make up what the mind-only person says and what he, as the middle way person, says in response. And these analogies all end up interacting with each other. So I'll just throw each of them out to you, and then we'll try to fill in more blanks as we go. So the first is the idea of dreams. And a couple of people brought this up in the last few days, like, are we going to get to dreams in relationship to all of this? Because it is the most obvious place in which we have an entire world, potentially with all the 5 physical senses appearing. I mean, objects of the 5 senses appearing. Thoughts, feelings, names, associations, depending on how you dream. I mean, different people dream differently, but some people can have some very, quote, realistic dreams. And what does realistic mean? It has all the stuff we have in our waking life. I just have to add this here. Master Alan Wallace even speaks about, you could learn to meditate on emptiness in your dreams. You could learn to sit down and do meditations and gain realizations in your dreams. He goes on somewhere else from there, but I'll leave it at that for now, because it just shows pretty much any experience that we could have in our waking life, potentially we could have in our dreams. With shamatha lucidity, it seems the sky is the limit, what your dream life could be like. But it seems like the mind-only school supposed person wants to say, hey, what we mean is just like dreams. Consciousness with nothing outside. Look, in your dreams, you have all the objects of the senses, and there's nothing there. All you need is consciousness. Are you convinced? So the counter argument, yeah, I didn't even translate the verse because it was so rough. But Tsongkhapa, in his gloss of Chandrakirti's verse 48, chapter 648, responds that if in a dream a mind, through its own inherent characteristics, were ever to take on the form of a herd of mad bulls, so your mind, in your dream, has just taken on the form, I mean, we don't have the purple elephant right now, we have a herd of mad bulls. Okay, you got it? Is it easier than skeletons? Then, just as there is no objective field of elephants in that dream, so too, according to, quote, my system, the middle way, a mind appearing through its own defining marks of mad bullness would not exist either, because it is something that could never start. I actually have to go back a little bit. Yeah, I tried to skip this. But the mind-only proponent, attempting to prove that consciousness must exist with its own defining characteristics, gives the example of a monk going to sleep in his little monastic cell, you got the picture now, and dreaming of a herd of mad elephants. There's a switch between the elephants and the bulls, and I'm not totally sure whether that's significant or not, but I kept noticing it in both commentaries. So the monk is dreaming of a herd of mad elephants. Since there's no way, if they were real, these elephants could fit inside his bedchamber, the example is meant to illustrate what it means for there to be a mental consciousness that experiences an appearance of outer objects where, in fact, no objects appear at all. That's the way I said it, but I just needed to give you the concrete background. So then Tsongkhapa is saying, well, if this really existing mind or really established mind were then to switch over and take on the form of mad bulls, then at that point, even as there's no objective field of elephants, so the mind that is defined by mad bullness couldn't exist either, because it could never start. And I'm not actually sure whether it meant if it had really been the elephants, it could never turn into the bulls, or whether it's simply using the Prasangika notion of it could never start, in the sense that you could never find the moment when one moment of mind would turn into another. Again, I don't want to take too much time with that. But I want you to be thinking about bulls and elephants. And why, when you wake up from the dream, the bulls and elephants are not really in the room. And yet, if there were a mind that really had turned into those bulls and elephants, when you woke up, why wouldn't they be there? If our waking, okay, this is the argument, this is part of the argument. If our waking life is being produced by a mind that really is defined by the characteristics of what it turns into moment by moment, and so the dream life is every bit as real then as the waking life, why, when you woke up, wouldn't the bulls still be there? Or the elephants, whichever one it is that you've been dreaming of. Because your waking world is as real and as not real as your dream world, because it's only your consciousness. Don't worry, you're not going to come to any conclusions about this one. I feel like it's one of those that we're just supposed to get stuck in the impossibility of those bulls being in the room when you woke up, and yet leaving us with, but what's the difference? What's the difference between our dream life and our waking life? Can we hold it? There's a long way to go. So yes, if the dreaming mind existed inherently, then when one woke up, all the things that it conjured should continue to exist, every bit as much as they did during the dream. Insofar as there is a subjective pole that can remember, during my dream I saw, then the memory from the point of view of the objective pole, that is the experience of an object that thinks during my dream I saw this, should have equal existential status. This is a point that Jetso Kappa makes. That the memory, I was there, so if that's established by definition, then I saw this, the thing I saw, should equally be established, if both are simply consciousness. So then the elephant should still be in the room when you wake up, because the eye is still there, so shouldn't the things that you saw be there? If the things that appear as objects are still of the same substance as consciousness itself. Again, this is an absurd consequence. It's not going to happen, we hope. Or if the elephants are not there, and obviously not, one would have to acknowledge that ultimately the dreaming consciousness had no more inherent reality than the animals, places, people, and situations it might have imagined. So on the other hand, since the elephants aren't there, don't you have to say that the consciousness that experienced them is equally ephemeral? And this is the key point. From a middle way point of view, both subjective and objective poles should always be equal in status, both equally lacking in definitive characteristics, and both equally illusory in their manner of appearing. So again, it's that the consciousness only arises in relation to its object, so the dream consciousness is as illusory as the things it sees. And our waking consciousness in its own way is as illusory as the things it sees, but for different reasons. And basically, Chandrakirti's middle way position still has a very precise way of maintaining that distinction between ordinary dream life and ordinary waking life. And in fact, it seems that Tsongkhapa is saying that the middle way school can do that more credibly than the mind-only school. That's the whole point about, well, wouldn't those elephants still be there? Because if reality is actually no more than mind appearing as this or that, then the mind of the dream is as real as the mind of the waking life. But according to the middle way view, the way in which karma manifests as outer objects in our waking life is actually much more complex than just my mind appearing as this or your mind appearing as that. And because the outer world is equally empty to the inner world, the way in which karma governs our experience of a shared world in the waking state with its physical sense object can be maintained as something suitably distinct from the weak and inchoate ripenings of karmic tendencies in the form of images projected in the dream state, as we all know. So the dream state is a karmic ripening of sorts. But the point that Jetsokapa makes repeatedly is these triads of consciousness, faculty, and object. He says in the dream, there can only be one kind of triad. It's all mental consciousness. I mean, it's mental consciousness, mental faculty, mental object. So even though it appears that there are visual objects and eyes to see them, sounds and ears to see them and so on, they are illusory and therefore false in the dream. And we wake up and say, oh, I thought I saw the elephants, but there were no elephants. Because it was just your mind appearing as elephants. And this is middle way can say, yeah, your mind was appearing as elephants. Fine. Or rather, an appearance to your mental consciousness looked like elephants. Ripening from weak, inchoate karma, sure. But that's not the same as standing in a field in Tibet or India and seeing a herd of elephants, or in Tibet and seeing you couldn't have the elephants in Tibet. Where there's what's called the sensory gateway of form, and it's seen by the eye faculty. And that's and in my sense, and Jetsokapa never says this specifically, but it's what I had to figure out over and over again, is the karma to produce outer objects is different from the karma that produces dream images. And we can't conflate them, or our world doesn't make sense. And the fact, the human experience of dreaming doesn't make sense if we try to say my dreams are every bit as real as my waking life. But there's another way, and I'm jumping ahead, there's another sense in which Jetsokapa will use the notion of illusion in relation to dreams, where he will extend the analogy of our ignorance to the sleep of ignorance and waking from the dream of our misperceptions. So we'll get there in a second, but I spoke a little bit earlier about focal condition and the notion of an eye consciousness in the Abhidharma sense needing to rely on the focal condition to trigger the eye consciousness, or each of the objects of that consciousness triggering the consciousness. And I sense again and again that Jetsokapa wants to preserve the full array of Abhidharma causes and conditions, even in a middle way sense. So there has to be the immediately preceding condition, there has to be the focal condition, there has to be the causal condition, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds of causal condition. One more I'm forgetting. And there has to be an environmental condition or a governing condition, which would be that particular sense faculty. And he doesn't like the way that, and Chandrakirti doesn't like the way that the mind-only school would potentially conflate all those conditions and say everything only relies on the bhakta. But note that I keep saying, Jetsokapa also, if you push it far enough, you can see how each of those conditions at some level will have sprouted from the 12 links. So nothing falls outside the 12 links of dependent origination. Indeed, the word dependent origination from which everything arises actually refers to the 12 links of dependent origination. And I tried to prove that in a separate argument. But he wants to preserve the variety of dependent relationships by which things arise, so that it's not unilateral Baktok ripening, shall we say. And I'm going to skip ahead because there's later an analogy of a blind man dreaming. And I'm not going to quite get this right because I haven't had time to review it, but basically it's the idea that, well, why can the images arise for the blind person during their dreams if those images are relying on nothing other than the karmic imprints? Why couldn't they equally well, and this is related to our conversation the other day, why couldn't those images equally well be arising when they're awake and they see a world? And if you say it's due to a damage of the faculty, well, if the faculty is only damaged in a mind-only sense because the karmic seed wasn't ripening into the faculty, then you still haven't explained the fact of blindness as being distinct from the ability to dream in images. And so in a sense, I think one of the big issues with the mind-only position is that it's collapsing a whole lot of complexity that actually does explain our world. And so if a theory of karma or an explanation of karma is going to make sense with all the complexity, even that we have now in a scientific age, you can say, well, I can point to the cells that are damaged. Don't tell me the only thing going on is particularly whether a particular bakchak is ripening or not. Because I, the doctor, I, the scientist, can see that these cells are damaged. Do I have the same bakchak ripening that this person has ripening as to whether they can see images or not, forms or not? So I think the middle way position that Jitso Kappa is espousing here actually allows for all of that. He says, yeah, you can have faculties, you can have damaged faculties. I won't, and I'm interpolating this, I won't say the reason for that damage of faculties didn't come from karma. It could have. But that's where I would suggest we start getting into maybe there are more than one karma at work. There's more than one karma at work in each perception. So that the part about the mind-only school where the faculty and the object of the faculty all come from a single seed might have to be modified even in order to support Jitso Kappa's presentation here. Again, I'm not saying that every detail in some way doesn't come from the 12 links. The way that the body itself developed in the womb later, the things that happened to the person. But it's the complexity of 64 karmas per finger snap, right? How many different things have to come together for our experiences to be what they are? And yes, faculties are different and working at a different level of reality than mental images. And then jumping ahead, this starts to make more sense for the examples of meditations, such as the skeletons that we did, where you're visualizing something that better not be real. And then the quite distinct example of the cataracts. So now I'll just, what am I going to do next? I'll just name what all these examples are, but it's still going to take a while for us to do them all. We've got dreams. We've got cataracts, i.e. a damage to the faculty, but not the same as blindness. The cataract analogy is different from the blindness analogy. We have the meditation on skeletons, that which is not real, but affects your mind in a certain way. And then performances, a whole bunch of people at a spectacle. Reflections in a mirror, which I don't have to tell you much about, we've all experienced them. And finally, an empty object that is perceived drastically differently by beings from different realms, such as So it'll take us a while to suss the difference out between all of those, right? Before I go too much further, though, I want to read this one sentence which summarizes the point I was making before, which is, Chandrakirti is refuting the mind-only version of a mental consciousness that could ever exist definitively without needing to rely upon an objective focal condition. Because according to their position, there are never any objects apart from consciousness. It would be, and this is, to me, the clincher, it would be a mind that only projects but never actually perceives. Because how can you really say that a mind has perceived something if the very same state of consciousness that is arising in the form of that thing is the thing that created that thing? I mean, that's a challenging statement in our lineage, to actually have to question that. Is there a difference between projecting and perceiving? And what was kind of shocking to me for a while was to be reading these arguments and realizing how many times I felt what I thought my own view might be was coming down on the mind-only school side of the argument. And so that's why I'm trying to share it with you. Obviously, I'll never succeed fully. But if one has a view where karma is unilaterally producing each moment of experience with no other factors involved, then you get into the situation of, I want to call it the blind man dreaming. You don't need faculties. You don't need objects. You have images coming up one after another, and the only reason for those images to shift is a shift in the tendencies. And as the argument comes up later, I mean, the opponent says, well, come on, why can the blind man have dreams in which there are images, but not see images when they're awake? And the mind-only school says, well, it's a difference in the tendencies. And the answer comes back, well, but what made the tendencies ripen differently in the dream than in the outside? And then the argument ends up having to turn back to there are no self-existent tendencies. Because it ends up starting to point to the idea of tendencies ripening through a nature of their own, i.e. with no other conditions. And so Tisakapa, following Chandrakirti, has to break down even the idea of tendencies ripening through a nature of their own, in order to disprove the idea that tendencies could ripen into experience without relying on anything else. So if you're uncomfortable, it's okay. That's what it is to be in this complex world of Buddhist philosophy. According to Tsongkhapa's perspective, every moment of conscious awareness, insofar as it has content, depends not only, as I've said earlier, on a previous moment of consciousness, but must still depend on the full array of causes and conditions presented in the Abhidharma. But, unlike Abhidharma, no part of that thing can ever be established as having an inherent nature. And so then more and more of the weight, shall we say, the burden of proof, keeps going back to the way that karma causes us to label things. But label as distinct from the projection of the entire image without relying on anything else. Do you get the difference? The dream is the perfect example of projecting the entire image without relying on anything else. Because you can have any dream anywhere. Because the senses have been withdrawn. You're not engaging in the world of shared karma anymore. In a dream, you have withdrawn from the world of interaction. And your mind can do its own trip. There's some mystery in this world of interaction that even the way that our karma ripens has to depend on interactions with other beings and their karma ripening, and a concrete world that's come about through forces that are really old. Again, to start to comprehend karma this way is to realize that our karma, the karma of this lifetime, ripens across millennia. Because the karma for me to experience this physical world includes things that happened billions of years ago, according to our scientific model. So then this is a key point to the notion of illusion, because I said, Jessica will acknowledge, oh yeah, the dream is illusory and the waking life is illusory, but in slightly different ways. So for the middle way view, rather than saying the mind is real, but outer objects are illusory, which seems to be this particular mind-only view, or that everything is really coming from your mind, this middle way perspective must maintain that all three poles of perception are equally false or deceptive. The consciousness is equally false as the thing that's perceived in the faculty. But false in a very specific way also, which is that they appear to the mind to exist through a nature of their own, and they don't. So the key point about illusion is it looks one way, it really is another. And so in the dream, it's a great analogy, even for the middle way, in that it looks like you have outer objects, but really it's only your mental consciousness. And so in our waking life, it looks like all three poles exist through the nature of their own, and none of them do. But notice that in this case, the fact of not existing by a nature of its own is not explicitly because it looks like it didn't come from your karma, but actually it does. To get down to the details of what it means for all three poles, the poles being, again, the consciousness, the faculty, and the object, to not exist inherently, it's a step removed from simply understanding how karma affected one's perception. Classically speaking, I want to say the Nagarjunian analysis of why none of the three can exist inherently has a lot more to do with the argument that then ensues on why you can't find a real past, you can't find a real way that the past turns into the present, you can't find a real way that the present turns into the future, and then you see that each is merely labeled. And so likewise, these three arise in dependence upon each other. So I did the time thing, but then the three arise in dependence upon each other, and you can't even label any one of them except in dependence upon the others. But to say that each of the three poles don't exist through a nature of their own is not simply saying because they do arise from karma, because that could send us right back to the mind-only view. You get it? I know I can feel the questions brewing. I'm going to just charge through for the moment. If that's okay with everybody. You can totally catch me afterward. But I want to get to this point about how dreams can become an analogy for our waking life, and then we can leave the dreams alone for a while. Therefore, insofar as in this world there is a sleep of not knowing, a sleep of ignorance, then to the perceptions of those who are in the waking state, being free of the ordinary sleep that is distinct from this ignorance. So this is Jessica. He's saying there is a sleep that is distinct from ignorance. And those who are in the waking state, being free of ordinary sleep, although things cannot grow through any of the essence of their own, nevertheless the perceptual triad still exists. Since the dream dreamed by the sleep of ignorance is still going on. And there he is explicitly coming back to the point that ignorance is the cause for karmic, ignorance, karmic traces, consciousness, as well as the later links of name and form and the 5 heaps. So the 5 heaps come later in the 12 links. They're not all lumped into link 3. They're distinct. Not completely separable, but distinct. So you have to have consciousness in order to have the separation into name and form, which is essentially the 5 heaps, and then even name and form further, or form further disambiguates into the 6 sensory gateways. So as long as the sleep of ignorance at link 1 is going on, you're going to have consciousness, 5 heaps, and 6 sensory gateways. In the same way, as long as one is not free of that sleep, or does not wake from that sleep, so long to those dreamers, the triad of objects, faculties, and consciousness will exist. So he's saying, because we're in the sleep of ignorance, we've still got perception, okay? But that perception requires the 5 heaps. That perception requires the sensory gateways. Just as for one who wakes from sleep, the triads from the dream have no existence. You know, as soon as you wake up, oh, the triads, you gotta get used to this, the symbol, the threesome. The triads from the dream drop out. So for all those Buddhas who have finished off or torn out from its root the sleep of illusion and have made manifest the absolute space of phenomena, since the triads have no existence, there is also no consciousness with nothing outside. So Jitsakapa here is turning that mind-only phrase back on itself and saying, hey, when the Buddhas wake up, it's not as if you'll still have consciousness, but you won't have any objects of consciousness anymore. He says all 3 will be wiped out. And this comes back to this notion of will enlightenment knock out consciousness? And so that's, again, will push us to distinguish different kinds of consciousness. But he certainly doesn't want there to be consciousness with nothing outside. And this really, I mean, if we went deeper into this, it would, I mean, deeper into the whole mind-only presentation of how one reaches enlightenment. You'd start to realize how different the views are. Because in one sense, the mind-only presentation of reaching enlightenment is about cleaning out the foundation consciousness until you have a consciousness that is only perceiving ultimate reality. And it's a beautiful presentation. But you see how almost if that consciousness is real and the seeds in it really have to be wiped out and the other seeds really have to be cultivated, you cannot practice Vajrayana at the level where you pull out the root of the person and the root of the person can arise as someone else. Because if there's a foundation consciousness that really holds all those negative seeds, then it's always there from its own side, in a sense. And that's why these kinds of arguments do become so relevant if you're trying to practice in such a way to pull the root of your reality day after day, hour after hour, and identify with a completely different level of being. If there's some foundation consciousness in the way that's really you, it's almost going right back to a self. It's almost going right back to a real person. Because if a foundation consciousness is a collection of all the seeds that were ever you, then yeah, well, I'm really my foundation consciousness. So if a Buddha has finished off or torn out from its root the sleep of delusion and made manifest the absolute space of phenomena, that's the yin again, the emptiness of all phenomena. Since all the perceptual triads have no existence, you can't hold on to consciousness. Now I love this because this gives us a glimpse. This is one of the most explicit glimpses I've ever seen in Jitsakapa on how Buddhas see sentient beings. You know our big question? Furthermore, to the holy gaze that sees how things exist, the triads do not appear. So the enlightened vision that is looking at the enlightened wisdom that sees how things are, there will be no triads. But to the holy gaze that sees things in their variety, the whole of deceptive reality, although for that subject state of mind itself, nothing appears by the power of being contaminated by the tendencies of ignorance, nonetheless, all those things that appear by the power of the contaminated consciousnesses of other persons, insofar as they appear to that holy gaze, appear to the Buddha. And this is divine knowledge. Don't worry, I'll say it again. Because the question comes up frequently, different kinds of texts. Well, if the cause of appearances in samsara is ignorance, and a Buddha lacks ignorance, how can the Buddha possibly see what we experience? If there's no reality to what we experience apart from what is projected by our ignorance, how can the Buddha see it? Because the Buddha doesn't have that ignorance. Have you ever encountered that question before? And I just love the specific. It's the only place I've ever seen Jetha Kappa say this quite so clearly. Well, there's one other place he says it clearly. And he's speaking specifically of the enlightened wisdom that sees the variety of all things. It says, although for that subject state of mind, nothing appears by the power of being contaminated by the tendencies of ignorance, because the Buddha has finished off those tendencies. Nonetheless, all those things that appear by the power of contaminated consciousness to others, i.e. our minds. So our minds, due to our contaminated consciousness, are producing our triads, all three together. Insofar as the things that appear to us appear to the Buddha, this is divine knowledge. So again, here's a Jetha Kappa source for the debate that Geshe Michael has reported. I think it was his Geshe debate. This question came up. And he says, they see how we see ourselves. There it is. I can read you the Tibetan if you want. And yeah, I did find one other passage where Jetha Kappa goes into even further details from a different book. Even on the difference of how a Buddha's holy body appears to the Buddha. And he literally uses the word from his own side, but he doesn't mean it as in self-existently. He just means from the Buddha's perspective. Those signs and marks are due completely to the purity of the Buddha's collection of merit. But to the sentient beings who can see a Nirmanakaya Buddha, the appearance of the Buddha to that sentient being is being clouded by the tendencies for ignorance in the mind of that being. It's just, again, a beautiful analysis of how, again, we have to be very careful about saying we're creating Buddhas or we're creating our teachers. That's not what he's saying. He's saying our tendencies for ignorance completely determine or over-determine how we will see that holy being. But that holy being does have qualities not that exist from their own side in the self-existent sense, but that are produced by their own causes. And that Buddha has the causes to be a Buddha, and to, as Geshe Michael would say, to see their arm as Manjushi's arm. Yeah.
So for me to see a Buddha, that being would also have to see themselves as a Buddha.
Matcha, not necessarily so. I think it is possible for us to have very pure perceptions of beings who may or may not see themselves as enlightened. And that depends a lot on our spiritual level. Like, it's one thing to have a very pure experience of a lama or a teacher or a friend or a partner or anything like that. But that may or may not be the same thing as meeting a Nirmanakaya Buddha. I mean, in the sutra sense, it's very specific what the conditions are to meet someone who is actually a Nirmanakaya of an enlightened being and has no other reality apart from that. There's no sentient being's mind there. I just want to be really careful saying anything about this because the scriptures repeat in so many different ways that our perceptions are impure and our perceptions are clouded about who anybody really is, and really in the sense of how they perceive themselves. So what I'm offering is there is, I think, a valid possibility that somebody could appear to us as a very holy being and affect us in that way, but not be perceiving themselves as totally enlightened. And I want to say, there is a sentient being's mind there. And it's also possible for someone to appear to us as thoroughly impure and utterly sentient being. And there's no sentient being's mind there. It's an emanation of the Buddha for our sake. I think it's also possible for there to be an actual emanation of a fully enlightened Buddha, and we perceive that as a holy being, but we can't yet see all their purity. And that's the example that Jetsun Kappa was dealing with in that other text. So you see, there's pretty much all the permutations there. And it goes back then to the logic course about proving to ourselves what we don't know about others. So are you ready for cataracts? So the mind only, just as the mind only school took the example of dreams to try to prove, hey, consciousness with nothing outside, just like your dream. The middle way kind of cut through that. The supposed mind only person comes back and says, hey, since it's possible to see things, if you have cataract, that is, since it's possible to see things even when there are no objects outside, because you've got something in front of your eye faculty, this proves that consciousness produces its own appearances from its own side without relying on anything outer, right? So either we take without cataracts as the arbiter of truth, in which case the appearance of hairs to the person with cataract would be false, or we take the definitively established mind, and we're back in the supposed mind-only school view here, cataract is the arbiter of truth, in which case the hairs would have to be real, even for the person who didn't have the cataracts. It's a leap I still have trouble with. Well, again, if there were no outer world that we had to rely upon to establish conventional reality, we didn't have to have a shared reality, then, and consciousness was the only thing creating anything, and that's my reality, and that's my valid perception, then the person with the cataracts sees the hairs, and so those hairs are real even for the person who doesn't have cataracts. If there's a definitively established mind for whom anything that mind produces, that's real. You have to get that thing, that added distinction of the thing to be refuted. That's definitively established. So, yeah. And I want you to get used to, I mean, I'm trying to get you to struggle with these things, because notice how many switches your mind has to go through just in order to imagine the situations. And this gets you ready to be able to identify the gotcha, the thing to be denied in your own mind. Because we all have different views, and we're all coming at this from a different place. And so it's a matter of figuring out, wait, which one am I hooked by? Which one do I feel like, yeah, that works? And then see if we can follow the logic to let it go. So either you say, okay, the normal person's right. So the person with cataract has a false vision. Or we take the definitively established mind of the person with cataracts as being the one who can really see. Because if every definitively established mind is equally right, that's the implicit idea there, is equally right, then the one who has cataracts has established them, and they have to be true for everybody else. Because if that mind existed definitively and therefore validly, then even if one did not have cataracts, as soon as anyone looked for the place where the person with cataracts was seeing hairs, the other person would also have to see hairs. And this is the key phrase, because they would be exactly the same in not having an objective field. So again, what would it mean to say there's nothing outer? You have perceptions with no objective field. So the person who's seeing the hairs and the person who's not seeing the hairs are exactly the same and having no objective field. So either you say there's no arbitration of truth and everybody's reality is completely equally right, or you have to say that what's real for one person must be real for somebody else. Either way, we're going to have problems. I'm just going to leave that one for you because we're going to deal with cataract a little bit more in relation to an analogy to karma itself. So it's going to annoy us a bit. So Chandrakirti compares the existence of karma as being like the person with cataracts. So we'll have to deal with that. But meanwhile, as I said, we have to just kind of hold all these examples in mind. Meanwhile, back to the idea of the blind person dreaming. The question arises, why wouldn't a blind person who is awake come to see physical forms in the rest just as well as someone who is not blind, as I said before? Like if it was only coming from their mind, why wouldn't they be able to see physical forms coming from their mind just as well as somebody who didn't have a damaged faculty? Because it doesn't depend on the faculty. Because in both the dream and the waking state, they're exactly the same in not having an eye faculty. Furthermore, if without form in the rest, consciousness could begin through its own nature, there would be nothing to distinguish a dream from the waking state at all. Sorry, I'm having to jump so many steps, but I hope it's still going to get something across. The middle way debater at a certain point comes back repeating the question of why would the blind person not be able to see forms just as well as awake as when dreaming if the forms were not coming from outside, they're only coming from the mind, and the lack of forms was not coming from a lack of eyes. And the dreams were not actually caused by the sleep. That was the part that keeps getting me. If you're holding everything to inherently be coming from mind, then the forms can't be coming from outside, the lack of forms can't be coming from lack of eyes, and the dreams can't be coming from sleep, because the mind-only school person had to come back and say, well, it was just shifting tendencies when they were asleep and just shifting tendencies when they were awake, but you can't say that sleep caused anything. You can't say that eye faculty had any effect. You lose the entire panoply of the situations that we live in. That's the way I want to almost say it. And if there were truly nothing outside, then there could be no other causal factor whatsoever but one's own mind itself. And this would be problematic even for a faithful mind-only proponent to defend as expressing the most profound meaning of dependent origination, because nothing is unilateral in dependent origination. Nothing is just coming from one thing, namely a linear ripening of seeds. It's very interesting to me that Tsongkhapa comments at that point. This, furthermore, is the way to encounter the thing to be refuted. When Jetsokapa says, this is how to encounter the Gakcha, I wake up. Like, I hope I wake up. Because he's saying, if you've gotten this far, you've seen exactly what it is your thinking is there but isn't there. And what I would suggest to you at this point would be a stream of karma's ripening that doesn't depend on anything else. Because if one has reified, if one has made the stream of karma's ripening self-existent to the point that they don't depend on anything else but the stream of karmas, then that's what he has just said is the thing to be refuted. It doesn't mean that our reality is not coming from a stream of karma's ripening. Notice my double negative. Our reality can be coming from a stream of karma's ripening. But there's actual interaction there. And there's this whole layered effect of what kind of karmas are creating what levels of our reality. Now I'm doing a riff, but it's from having thought about it a lot. There are karmas that are producing our physical body. And those at one level ripen very early in life, and to just have a physical body at all. And then they keep a certain kind of stream, the fact that my body ripens into certain cells and those cells continue to configure in a certain way. If that is being governed at some deep level by mind, Middle Way has said that all three realms are created mainly by the mind. And the mind is dependent upon karma. Then the physical faculties themselves at some level are being governed by an unfolding mind. But the mental consciousness, I almost want to say they're like different planes. We said something the other day about like these shifting screens and holograms. So it's like our karma, because everything's ripening at different layers. I think this might help to explain the complexity of our lives. That it's not just a linear, that's very easy for teaching karma, the beginning of level, just like one thing after another. But if we can start to think of our lives as different layers of karma producing different layers of experience, some at the personal physical level, some at the cosmic physical level, some at the planetary physical level, some at the interpersonal physical level, some at the surface consciousness level, some at the deep consciousness level, some at the subconscious sleep level. And so that's why we can go into sleep and certain karmas ripen in our sleep and we go, where did that come from? But then we can still associate it with images that pass through our mind during the day. And then we can go into meditation, or we can go into retreat and get deeper into our, quote, subconscious and dredge those things that are somehow lurking there. All of this, I would think, helps us avoid a deterministic view of karma as forcibly, like there's only one trajectory of how my karma can ripen. But if you have this model almost, and we're still working with models, but if you start to work with a model where these different layers of karma are ripening in different ways, so that it's valid to say, well, there's an outer object, and it triggered a consciousness, and that consciousness was able to see it in a certain way because it saw it in that way 500 times before in this life, or 5,000 times before in this life. But it also leaves us the room to have an outer object arise, the eye to see it, and the mental response to be different than it was the last 500 times. Because we planted a seed in meditation that was going to trigger that when you see something like that, you'll think differently. See what I mean about how these different layers can then, we can have stuff still in our concrete cement world, if you've heard that analogy. The world that's fully ripened karma, it's coming at us, but because we planted a different seed in meditation, we'll react differently. But then when we focus very hard, perhaps, on a certain powerful karma, that could actually ripen as our full-on outer world. But maybe our mind isn't quite mature enough to be able to engage with it. See what I mean? Like, we might have an extraordinary teacher, but our mind is still really immature. And to me, it's liberating to think this way and to get all this backup of a middle way view that allows for that kind of complexity and gives all the more reason to try to plant our lives with karmic means, but also to accept why things won't always go so well in that process because of the number of layers of karma we have to be able to work on in order to eventually see every last aspect of our world transform. Not to mention acknowledging that other people have karmic streams of their own that we have a particular perspective on, but planting our karma will not instantaneously change those people until the scope of the reality we can affect has gotten so big that they validly call us Buddha. You see what I'm saying? Like, yes, eventually, hopefully, we can affect everybody, but only through such a fundamental change in who we are that the scope of our actions is no longer limited to that which is projected by the tendencies for ignorance. So it is 5:15. I think that's a good place to stop. I'm tired. I hope you're not quite as tired as I am, but I imagine that I've exhausted you. So we will pick up again with skeletons, performances, reflections, and empty rivers. Empty rivers being vessels of liquid that are perceived differently by different beings. But we've done a lot today, and thank you for bearing with me so attentively and really bringing your own hearts and minds to this. So as we offer the mandala, I encourage you to place there your own perhaps nascent vision early on, just burgeoning vision of what a pure world might be like. A world free of the cataracts of ignorance, the blindness of ignorance, the sleep of ignorance, which is created only by the totally pure seeds of wishing to bring the mind of every living being to its highest potential. And as I said yesterday, in our meditation this afternoon continues to reinforce, we carry with us the intentions of every living being on this planet, especially keeping in mind those who are in the in-between state now, for whom the possibilities of karma shifting are so immense. Such tremendous possibility to enter a pure world right now. And by our prayers and efforts, may all those in transition reach the pure world for which we pray. Sashi Jushi Mezzotron Mira Vinci Ninte Nyapani Sangye Shingu Mikte Uvari Dokun Namdak Shingla Jupasho Yam Guru Ratna Mantalakam Niryatayam Yo Sunamishe Soksoshi Sunamishe Lejun Ambakuni Topasho
and